So I'm about to go out for a pretty short ride outside. I've had a lot of work today and I'm just getting out about an hour of sunset left. I'm gonna use it as a warm-up, and then I was curious to try a little experiment and get on the trainer afterwards and do some Sweetspot. Me and Gregory last Sunday recorded a video where we were talking about Sweetspot training and polarized training, because I feel like there's this like false dichotomy between proponents of Sweetspot training and Stephen Seiler and more old school training methods that kind of advocate for, you know, a lot of low intensity stuff that's pretty comfortable and a little bit like, you know, 10 to 20% of any given training program being really high intensity stuff. Of course, there's road noise. Anyway, we'll see how it goes. But for this ride, I'm just gonna go out, try to get an hour in, or like just under an hour before it gets dark, and then hop on the trainer, do some Sweetspot training. We'll see how it goes. My expectations for the next hour are like really quite low. I just want to get some time in, pedal my bike, have some time outside, because you know, being outside is really nice, even though it's kind of cold this time of year. But I don't know, it's pretty mild today, and right now I'm actually just happy that the air quality is decent, because it hasn't been that great lately. But we'll see how it goes. I'm gonna go for another 10 or 15 and then flip it before I go home to hop on the trainer. Yeah, yesterday I did a 3x20 workout on the trainer, and I'm not in the best shape ever by a long shot, but it was still a really solid workout and it felt good. I was doing around 390 or just over for those 3 efforts. So over the course of an hour, it's like it's around 1,400 calories of fuel being burned, most of which is gonna come from muscle glycogen. So I torched like at least half of my glycogen stores just doing those efforts, and then obviously rode for over 2 hours, so burned a lot more than that. I felt pretty depleted. So in some ways, I was actually really kind of torn about what I would do today. I thought I would do an easy ride, but since I'm not like too particular about my training at this moment, I was just getting really excited about doing some experimentation. And yesterday when I was doing those efforts, at first I was like kind of concerned that I wasn't going to be able to maintain power throughout the workout because it was feeling pretty hard, but I was able to maintain power pretty all right. So even if I'm pretty tired today, I figured it'd be interesting to see what it's like to warm up on the road for an hour and then hop on the trainer for a little while and do a lot of riding at around Sweetspot, and I'll just see how it goes. Like, I'll do my best, but what I'm interested in is looking at Stephen Seiler's work on polarized training and his view that polarized training is much more effective than Sweetspot training, but he defines his polarized training model in 3 heart rate zones, and he's really interesting in that he seems to prefer not to include pace or power in his establishment of zones, which seems really interesting since that's exactly how pretty much every athlete trains these days, now that GPS computers allow runners to run by pace quite easily anytime, and they naturally will have a good sense of their pace anyway. And then cyclists obviously have had power meters for years, and most serious cyclists entirely base their zones or training intensity on power. I personally pay a lot of attention to power and heart rate and perceived effort, and I know that there's a lot of correlation between those 3. There's also a lot of variation between them. So notably, I know from experience that if I'm doing Sweetspot training, or basically like a high tempo kind of pace in the mid to high 300s, it takes me a while for my heart rate to get up there. And so I'm kind of curious to pay attention to that if I specifically target Sweetspot efforts, how that'll play out in my heart rate, and looking at maybe some of my old rides as well. But if it takes a long time for me to get my heart rate up into what Seiler considers to be zone 2, then it's pretty interesting because his conclusions about polarized training would be kind of, I don't know, limited in their scope if in fact cyclists do a lot of polarized training or do a lot of sweet spot training and they target it based on power, but when in fact they're doing that, they're still having their heart rate mostly in zone 1. So anyway, I'm just curious to explore that, and I'm kind of looking forward to the challenge of seeing how much I can do riding at around 360 watts when I'm back on the trainer in half an hour, but we'll see how it goes. Should be fun. Right now, I'm just really happy to be outside. The air quality has not been great, so I was riding inside largely for that reason yesterday, but also because I wanted to do a workout. Okay, so that was fun. I just finished riding up the Zwift version of Alpe d'Huez and just tried to keep it around 350 or 360 and watched a little bit of a movie, which wasn't great, but it's okay. And just soft pedaling for a few minutes before I go inside to shower and have some food and then check in after. And mostly I was trying to keep it like 350 to 360, which would be, 90% of my threshold or like just over. And at least right now it would be. And I was trying to keep it as relaxed as possible and breathe comfortably so that I could keep my heart rate down around like 140 to 145 most of the time. Early on, my heart rate lags a little bit, so it took a little bit of time to get elevated, but later on it was like hovering in the low to mid 140s. So I'm gonna go back and take a look at the ride and offer some comments on it, and then put that in the context of polarized training versus sweet spot training, and whether or not there's any like actual conflict there or what the conflict is. And I don't know, hopefully this is interesting to you. I really like this kind of thing.
Okay, so yesterday I did a pretty fun session where I rode steady for an hour outside, then I hopped on the trainer and I rode the Zwift version of Alpe d'Huez, which I have up here. And what I want to look at is my heart rate and power throughout that effort, and put that in the context of various ideas about sweet spot training versus polarized training, and whether or not there's actually any real dichotomy there between those two supposed conflicted approaches. So basically yesterday I rode up Alpe d'Huez or the Zwift version of it. I wasn't actually in France, that would be cool. And I did 357 watts for 51:30 approximately. My average heart rate was 140. And I kept it around there for most of the effort. I hit 150 and just over just in the last few minutes. When I got to the top of the virtual Alpe d'Huez, I was, I ran out of road and I was like, oh, I'll just like dig in and push hard for the last couple of minutes. So I did, 385 for the last few minutes and got my heart rate above 150 and averaged about 147 for that the last few minutes. But if you look at the whole climb before that, here we go. Yeah, so I started a little before the climb. But yeah, so I did 48 and a half minutes at 139 heart rate average. I averaged 356, which is pretty much exactly what you would think is like the middle to high end of power prescriptions for what people regard as sweet spot training. I didn't even hit 147 until the last few minutes. Before that, I was mostly like low 140s to 145, and apparently hit 146 at least once or twice. But I was like pretty mindful about paying attention to what my heart rate was, and I was trying to keep it strictly less than 145. So I'd hit 146 or 147 for a few seconds here or there, but you can definitely be sure that 98% of all of that time I was at or below 145 heart rate. And if you think that my peak heart rate is 180, which I have hit a couple of times over the last few years, so by most people's assessment of what you would regard your peak heart rate is, which is like your actual peak heart rate, 80% of that would be 144. So strictly speaking, I spent like 99% of my ride yesterday in what Stephen Seiler would regard as zone 1. So he has a 3-zone heart rate model where zone 1 is like not very hard and it's like general aerobic conditioning and it's less than 80% of your max heart rate. Zone 2 is kind of no man's land, where he doesn't advocate that you spend much time there. And it's impossible to avoid spending any time there, because obviously your heart rate has to like drift between Zone 1 and Zone 3 when you're doing harder workouts. And as you get into your intensity for your hard workouts, and as you drop back down from your intervals, you're going to see some time in Zone 2. But from 80 to 87 or 88% of your max heart rate, you don't want to spend a lot of time there. And then when you're doing hard workouts, you want it to be above 88% of your max heart rate. And so, using that model, I was 100% like following his kind of recommendation that you'd spend very little time in Zone 2, or what he calls Zone 2, and spend a lot of time in Zone 1. And obviously yesterday wasn't a very intense workout, so I wasn't trying to do like hard intervals. But in contrast, like this is exactly what people describe as sweet spot training. And it wasn't a short period of time. It wasn't like I was doing 15 or 20 minute sweet spot efforts. Like this was almost an hour of training at sweet spot. And it wasn't even like low sweet spot. It would like right now I would regard my threshold, my real world kind of threshold power to be like maybe 390, let's say. So if I was looking at doing 88 or 90% of 390, let's say 88%, I'd be looking at 343. If we were looking at 90% of 390, it'd be 351. So I was like above 90%, just slightly above 90% of my threshold power. I'm pretty sure I couldn't do 400 for an hour right now. I was definitely on the high end of what people regard as sweet spot, and I was still in Zone 1 by Stephen Seiler's model pretty much almost the entire time that I was riding yesterday. So anyway, I think that I'll look into more of people's prescriptions of how to use sweet spot training as a part of your whole training program, and take a look at whether or not that's very useful to you. Personally, I think it is very useful, but I also 100% agree with Stephen Seiler's assessment and that of many others over the years, that you don't want to spend a lot of time doing, pretty hard workouts where you get tired, you use up your capacity to recover, and you spend a lot of time stressing your body, but you're not spending much time like actually creating that really big stress workload that you need to get into peak fitness. So especially early in a training program, especially if you're limited on time and you can't do really high volumes of training, I think that sweet spot training can be very effective at improving your aerobic conditioning and improving your endurance, because you can burn through a lot of glycogen, you can do a lot of like comfortably high calorie output rides and training sessions, but it's not necessarily gonna burn you up in the same way that doing threshold intervals would if you did, let's say, a long ride with like 4x15 or 4x20 minutes of threshold. But on the other hand, if you're a pro rider and you're riding 20 to 30 hours a week, you might see people doing that even during the winter time. But it's, even then, there's a big difference between doing threshold, which would be like a little below your FTP. So like, let's say my threshold when I'm in decent shape is like 400 or so, and I do threshold work that's like 380 to 390. That's definitely targeting my threshold, but it is strictly below, and it's much less stressful than if I did full gas efforts that were like 410 or 415 for like 15-minute efforts or something like that. The amount of intensity and the amount of stress that those two types of sessions would create are very different. And one of them is going to drive peak fitness. One of them is going to help kind of build up your foundation so that you can do those peak workouts later. And there's a big difference in just that like 20 or 30 watt difference of power that you would be doing. But in any case, mostly for this little experiment that I did yesterday and in this video kind of talking about it, I wanted to kind of tease out the fact that sweet spot training can be very useful. You definitely don't want to be spending a ton of time going, very hard, but not full gas. And I think that Stephen Seiler is totally right in his approach. And there's a lot of studies that would demonstrate that you don't want to be spending a lot of time doing that like hard but not too hard work. You really want to focus on high quality workouts and a lot of kind of aerobic conditioning that's a little more comfortable and not that stressful. I don't know, I just thought this would be a fun thing to talk about, especially because Gregor and I made a video. We recorded on Sunday our call that we're going to post on Friday, and then subsequently I saw that somebody else had produced a video on exactly the same topic, and I was just getting pretty excited about doing more content about this topic of sweet spot and polarized training and how to orchestrate your training program. But anyway, that's it for this one. Definitely let me know if this is interesting to you. Ask me questions in the comments if you want. Make fun of how out of shape I am, and I'll see you in the next video.